long before Brian Greene, long before all of these individuals who they honor so well, long before Copernicus, long before Galileo, Kepler, Stuttgart, Germany, long before them, ancient Kemites were talking about how the origins of the universe came to be. And one of the things that Dr. Diop talks about, that he says is even more powerful, is the fact that our ancestors at a very early date even dared wonder what happened before the beginning began, which is a radical philosophical thought, because you can think about what happened when things started, but you think what existed before things started, existence before existing began to exist, is a radical thought that takes a deep philosophy, but it also takes a technological age in order to even start you on the road to think that. See, the thing about us as a people, many times we honor those great civilizations, but fundamentally we don't understand that long before they were so great, they had to have gone through a series of great times to get to that great point, like the Nok culture of Nigeria. We can date the Nok culture of Nigeria back to 1200 BC. Those heads, those Nok heads, and the wax, and the way he did their art. We can trace that back to 1200 BC. But it took a whole bunch of time before it got to that. So that it's not just when the Nok heads were created we should celebrate. We actually should celebrate when they first started even thinking about doing the lost wax method, or thinking about taking a head and making it so finely tuned. You got to get to a higher level of thinking before you could even get to that point. So that our thinking of our ancestors has to change also. Now I know in our school systems we use maps. We use a map called the Mercator map. Well, here's the Peter projection. This is what actually shows the sizes of the continents as they really are. This map, Arnold Peters was a German cartographer. Cartographer is someone who makes maps. Cartographer began to access pictures taken from outer space by spaceships. And when he began to do this, he began to record cartographically what he was looking at. And as you can see, on this side is the Mercator map, which is used in classroom. Mercator comes from the concept of mercantilism or business. It was built when people began to go out. Now, our brother Cash showed you these early maps, that Africans actually had maps. And this is the map that came out of the ancient African maps, so they would get on the seas and travel. This is what the continents actually look like from outer space. This is mathematical calculations that they took from another people. Didn't quite get it right because what did they do? They added their own political emotion to it. But when you take the actual picture of the world, Africa is much larger. South America is much larger, Australia is much larger, India is much larger, and Europe is much smaller. And first of all, let me tell you something else. For your geography classes, if you're in school and you study what continents are, they are defined as large land masses surrounded on all sides by water. Now, if I look at that right there, I don't see Europe surrounded by water. I see it surrounded on three sides, and that's how we define a peninsula. Europe is not a continent, it's a peninsula. So let's get that straight. And while we're getting that straight, let's get something else straight. There are not 9 planets, there are only 8. And that's why 8 was such a divine number to the Kemites and to the Dogon. And to most of the ancient societies, because when you came up with the Ennead or the number 9, it was not 9 planets, it was 8 planets and the Father, Mother, the God. That made 9 entities. That was the Ennead. The Odos was the 8. The Ennead was the 9, but not 9 planets. Pluto is not a planet. It can't be a planet. Scientifically, it can't be a planet. They're wrestling with the concept now because they're going to have to change those books. And it's going to cost a whole bunch of money to change those books. Plus, they're going to have to explain why they've been wrong for so long. But they weren't around to know, like the Kemites were around for thousands of years, the Dogon for thousands of years. So by the time they came on the scene, they thought Pluto was a planet because they saw something out there. in the early part of the 90s, Pluto had crossed over into Neptune, and Neptune was the furthest planet from the sun because Pluto circulates around Neptune. Not only that, but you've got 4 inner planets and you've got 4 outer planets, divided by what we call the asteroid belt. The 4 inner planets are hard and crusty, and the 4 outer planets are large and gaseous. Yet you've got this little thing smaller than our moon out there circling around Neptune, that little hard thing, and we call that a planet. It can't be a planet because where it is. And yet we still buy into it. Why? I tell the children too. I said, don't be wrong because you know the right answer. Because if you say there are 8 planets, they're going to mark you wrong. If you say there are 6 continents, they're going to mark you wrong because it's going to hurt their ego to know Europe is not a continent. It can't be. Not to mention there is no continent. It was all one continent at one time. Our ancestors called it Flattop. Science calls it, by Wegener, calls it Pangea. And one day, if you have family in California, don't mean to shout nobody out. But that westernmost part of California is going to be to the United States or Cuba is to the United States. It's going to be a little island. Right off the coast of the United States of America. On the Peters projection map, this is what Africa looks like. Now, first of all, the one reason why I use this, I want you to know that these are not the names of the countries of Africa. This is what came out of the 1885 Berlin Conference when Europe carved up Africa. This was never any of the countries. They didn't call this. This was all for Europe's sake. Because they understood the future of the world was Africa. They wanted to carve Africa up as soon as possible and be able to get. So they all sat down, like, you know, the G7 did? They all sat down and made arrangements. Okay? They all sat down and decided, look, yo, man, you don't come into Kenya, I don't come into Liberia. I don't go into Liberia, you don't go into Sierra Leone, I'll leave Kenya alone. The only thing we can't deal with is Ethiopia because the elders are too tall, and them brothers and sisters too big, and them sisters in Ethiopia don't mess with them Panda caves, and they will hurt you. Because even when the brothers don't do what they're supposed to do, the queens take over and tell the brothers, sit back, I'll take care of business if you're not man enough to do what you got to do. Sisters take a note. The brothers don't step up. Okay, now, let's look at how Africans look at the world, because this is very interesting. This comes from our brother Tony Browder. In his book where he talks about a southern orientation of the world, because according to where you are in the world is how you want to look at the world. Okay, we look at the world from north to south basically because Europe is in what we call the northern area. But really it's not. Because if you look at the earth from outside, who's to say what's up and what's down? It's going to your orientation. It's going to how you're looking at things. If you want to look at it from an African perspective, this basically is how you look at it. Europe is on the bottom and Africa is on the top. And the scientific reason why you would do this is through oceanography, or if you want to call it geology, because the major river of Africa, which is called H.I.V, or we call it the Nile, some people call it the Nile, I call it H.I.V, it flows from south to north. And this is one thing with Dr. Ben, our brother Dr. Ben. Give brother Dr. Ben a right. One of the things about Dr. Ben is that he always used to talk about the south to north movement of the happening. I could never really fathom that because I was so European in my orientation. I couldn't understand how a river, because the Mississippi River, which we're used to, the European river that we're used to, flows from north to south. So we say we're going down south. Where our ancestors say, I'm going down north. I'm going up south. I just have to figure that out. Well, this map is what answers that question. The origins of life. The origins of life as we have tracked it in science today is in 3 countries. Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya. It's where it's believed that the origins of the human family came from. Straddles the equatorial belt. The peoples of this area must be dark complexion, well melanated, very curly hair. Curly hair because of the nature of the sun beating down so hard on their head that this very curly hair acts almost like a protective force. The scalp produces an oil that in the heat of the sun, it cooks the oil, so the oil never really is produced. It's only act as a lubricant or a protector of the scalp. As the African family moved more north, there was no need for this covering, so that the oil that was produced was allowed to produce, and that's what made the hair get straighter. And as we moved further and further away from the belt, that hair began to change, a number of things began to change.